But the cornerstone of Reagan's legacy, and any claim he might have on presidential greatness, is the notion that his leadership won the Cold War for America.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The struggle to contain and then stop the spread of Soviet communism begins, of course, with Harry Truman and goes through all of the presidents. But what Ronald Reagan does is he makes it into a moral thing. He says this is an evil empire. It's going to collapse.
Communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written.
Using his strong rhetoric as political cover, Reagan was able to take a softer approach with his Soviet counterpart when the opportunity presented itself.
Reagan, to his credit, sees that in Gorbachev he has someone he can negotiate with, and Reagan seizes upon that. They have 4 summit conferences, summit meetings, and this does move the Soviet Union along the road toward the collapse, which occurs in 1989, 1990.
When Reagan went to Geneva for the first of his summits with Gorbachev, aides were worried that the president would be overmatched by the more detail-oriented Soviet leader. Gorbachev, a former engineer, was reputed to be a master of the intricacies of geopolitics and weapon systems.
But they became fast friends. They met in Geneva, 4 hours of talks. And I finally got the nerve up to ask Reagan one time at a little private dinner. I said, you know, you weren't a detail man. I said, how'd this happen? I remember Reagan looked at me and said, oh, Hugh, he said, he didn't know any of that stuff either.
In 1983, Reagan unveiled what was to be one of the most bizarre presidential initiatives of all time.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was largely a product of Reagan's own imagination.
It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house.
Well, I have to tell you, SDI, the so-called Star Wars initiative, was a shock to most of us on the White House staff. We never saw it coming. And it was Reagan being Reagan. It was something he wanted to do, and he didn't want to staff it out.
Although dismissed by most as impractical, it now appears that the Soviets took SDI seriously. Suffering from internal economic problems, Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with an arms race in space.
Whatever one thinks about the military merits of it, I think it was a masterstroke diplomatically. It was at that point that the Soviets came to the realization, we can't compete with this. We can't keep up in the arms race. And I think that SDI, in retrospect, hastened the end of the Cold War.
During a 1987 visit to the divided city of Berlin, Reagan put an exclamation point on his rhetorical war against Soviet communism.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I thought it was a joke. I never expected that this daring statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, would have any effect. It was just simply rhetoric, words playing to the audience. But then it happened.
By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Ronald Reagan had retired to California. His supporters give Reagan credit for causing both the collapse of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself a year later.
This idea that Reagan won the Cold War is terribly overblown.
It was Reagan's luck to be in the right place at the right time.
I think the Cold War was won by a succession of Republican and Democratic presidents over a period of 40 years who were willing to stay the course against the expansionist aims of the Soviet Union.
When Ronald Reagan died in June of 2004, he was eulogized as one of the greatest presidents of all time, and some wondered if there was room for one more face on Mount Rushmore. Only time will tell if Reagan joins that elite pantheon. What is clear is that Reagan was a substantial figure in American presidential history, a key player in ending the Cold War, revitalizing the conservative movement, and assuring America that it was still okay to wave the red, white, and blue.